The motorbike was too loud for a night this quiet. Hagrid knew it the way he knew most things that couldn't be helped, with his whole body and without complaint. The engine's roar tore through the November dark above Surrey like something that had no business being in the sky. And below him, the identical rows of sleeping houses scrolled past, orange-lit and oblivious. He adjusted Harry against his chest and checked that the blanket hadn't slipped. The baby was awake. Had been awake since Godric's Hollow, those green eyes open in the dark, steady and calm in a way that seemed impossible for someone 15 months old and orphaned not 6 hours past. He thought he probably had a third in him, but not yet. The night smelled of exhaust, and underneath everything the chalk and cinders smell of the ruined cottage, still clinging to the bundle in his arms. He'd thought about it constantly since leaving James first in the front room, and then Lily on the nursery floor, and then Harry in the rubble of the crib with the lightning bolt scar fresh on his forehead and no explanation that made sense. Sirius had been there already, white-faced, very still. He'd pressed the motorbike keys into Hagrid's palm. Take it, and when Hagrid had said, "You'll need it," Sirius had said, "Not anymore," and walked away into the cold. Age 21. Toward something Hagrid didn't think he'd walk back from tonight. The baby made a small sound, and Hagrid pressed his thumb to Harry's fist. The grip closed around it at once, the automatic reflex of an infant who didn't know there was nothing left to hold. "Nearly there," Hagrid said, into the engine noise and the dark and the wind. Surrey was below him. He could see the map of it in the streetlights, the identical rooftops, and he knew which house he was looking for. And he held Harry tighter against the cold and the grief of doing what needed doing when everything had already gone wrong. Harry. Hagrid's arms were empty, not gone in the sense of falling. There was no drop, no cry, no weight leaving his hold. Harry was simply no longer there. One moment warm, breathing small, real, the next cold air where the child had been. He grabbed at nothing. The blanket was also gone. The motorbike lurched sideways and he corrected it on pure reflex, twisting around to look below him, scanning the dark as though there was somewhere to look. There was nothing falling. Just the city, just the road. A lit window in a house whose occupants had no idea anything had happened tonight. Harry, Hagrid said, and that was all he had. On the other side of London, in a quiet street that most people couldn't locate even when searching for it, a Goblin Courier had been waiting outside number 11 since shortly past 10 o'clock. He was a compact creature in a Gringotts coat, with a sealed envelope in his satchel and a professional commitment to completing the delivery. The envelope contained the last will and testament of Lily Jane Potter, deceased as of that evening, its seal infused with a guardian binding clause designed to activate upon delivery to the named party. His instructions had been explicit: deliver to Sirius Orion Black, registered address 12 Grimmauld Place, London. He had checked the Gringotts ledger twice. The records were unambiguous. He knocked at number 12. The door opened. A woman in her middle 50s stood in the frame. Dark eyes, grey-streaked hair, drawn back with ferocious precision. Mourning clothes that had clearly been worn before and found appropriate still. She examined him with the flat contempt she reserved for anyone who knocked after 9 o'clock. Behind her, in the dimness of the entrance hall, Creature hovered with a feather duster and an expression of absolute readiness. "Gringotts," the goblin said, and held out the envelope. "Legal correspondence for Sirius Orion Black, registered at this address." Walburga Black looked at the envelope. The seal broke the instant her fingers closed around it at the threshold. Magic does not wait for correct circumstances. The guardian binding clause required 3 conditions. delivery to the named address, a hand at the threshold receiving the document, and the seals breaking. It did not require the named guardian to be present. It did not, in any of its drafted language, account for a routing error. All three conditions had been met. The sound it made was soft, a single small crack, there and gone before it fully registered. Something small, in Halloween robes gone cold, with travel, dark hair disordered, a scar on its forehead, thin and pink, already losing the livid red it must have worn an hour ago. Lightning-shaped, precise, a mark that had no business being on a 15-month-old's face. Harry Potter looked up at Walburga Black. He did not cry. His eyes were very green. Walburga's face moved through recognition, fury, and something colder. A calculation she hadn't intended to be making tonight. She knew who this child was. The whole wizarding world knew by now, or would before morning. She knew whose eyes those were, and she knew with the acuity that had kept her a significant woman through decades of upheaval that disposing of the boy who lived would bring a scrutiny she had no interest in surviving. The child was on her doorstep, and there was no one coming to retrieve him. She was still reading this arithmetic when Creature moved. House elves do not decide to protect. It is not a decision so much as something older than decision, a reflex written into the creature below language or instruction. An infant was on the threshold of the Black family house, in the cold, without explanation. The calculation Creature made took no time at all. He was past Walburga's arm before the feather duster had finished falling. He gathered Harry from the cold stone of the doorstep with hands that were small and surprisingly capable, and carried him without ceremony with the matter-of-factness of something already settled into the entrance hall of 12 Grimmauld Place. Walburga stood in the open doorway with the will in her hands. She looked down at the handwriting. Lily Potter's script, the loops of a woman who had been 21 years old when she'd written this, and who had apparently spent some portion of those 21 years drafting legal instruments with consequences that were still arriving. She shut the door. The November street was empty. The Goblin Courier was already gone. Hagrid set the motorbike down badly on Privet Drive, one wheel catching the curb, and stood in the road with his hands at his sides and looked at the small, neat house with its trimmed hedge and the name D.U. Arsley on the letterbox, and its dark, ordinary, sleeping face. Dumbledore was on the pavement, very old, silver-haired, half-moon spectacles pushed down his nose, hands clasped before him, with the stillness of someone already calculating. McGonagall stood at his left with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Hagrid said, "He was there, I had him, and then he weren't, he stopped. The words wouldn't come into any shape that explained what had happened. Dumbledore said, 'Quarter of an hour, maybe 20 minutes, somewhere above Surrey.'" Hagrid shook his head. "He didn't fall, Professor. There was nothing falling. He was in my arms, and then he wasn't. The silence that followed had weight." Dumbledore turned and looked at number 4. At the dark window above the door, the name on the letterbox. His hand moved toward his breast pocket, where the letter for Petunia Dursley had been folded into thirds since 9 o'clock, and then came back to his side. "The blood protection," McGonagall said. "Cannot be placed," Dumbledore said. "The enchantment required Harry to arrive here, Petunia to take him in, Harry to live in this house and call it home. None of those things have happened, and they cannot be made to happen retroactively. What I designed for this address required this specific beginning, a pause. That beginning has not occurred." McGonagall looked at the hedge. She said nothing. "He is alive," Dumbledore said, with the particular certainty that is sometimes indistinguishable from will. His magical signature is present somewhere in Britain. He is displaced, not dead. We will find where he has been taken. He was already reaching for his wand. We will find him tonight." Hagrid sat down heavily on the motorbike seat. He thought about the grip of Harry's fist around his thumb. The green eyes looking up at the dark sky above Surrey, wide and steady, and completely unafraid of a world that had already taken everything from him that night. "Yes, sir," Hagrid said. Dumbledore had already turned away, wand in hand, and behind him number 4 Privet Drive sat dark and quiet, with its ordinary name on its ordinary door, the letter in Dumbledore's pocket, already a relic of a plan that had ended before it had begun. The motorbike still sat at the curb outside. Number 4. Dumbledore had not moved it. He stood on the pavement in the pre-dawn cold, with his wand out and his eyes closed, casting the same location charm for what was now the 22nd time, and for the 22nd time the thin, bright thread of it reached north, felt Harry's magical signature somewhere unresolved and alive, and then lost its anchor and came back empty. A child without a fixed address, a child in motion, or somewhere the charm couldn't name, not dead. That was the piece of information he was holding on to with both hands. It was nearly 5 in the morning. The house behind him was still dark. McGonagall had not gone home. She was standing 3 paces to his left, with her arms crossed, her expression doing what it always did when she disapproved of something that could not be undone. She had not said, "I told you," in any of the several ways available to her. "He is alive," Dumbledore said. Not for her benefit, she already knew, but because saying it aloud seemed to matter. "Yes," McGonagall said. And then, very precisely, the enchantment is gone. Irreversibly, he lowered his wand. The blood protection required Harry to arrive at this address, to be received here, to call this house home. None of those things have occurred, and they cannot be created retroactively. A pause that lasted a moment too long. I did not consider that Lily might have made her own arrangements. The silence that followed was the kind that did not need filling. Remus Lupin learned about Godric's Hollow from a ministry owl that arrived before dawn. He read the message standing at the kitchen table of his rented room in Wales, a narrow room above a post office, adequately heated, the cheapest thing he'd been able to find after his last post had quietly let him go. He read it once, and then again, and then set it down and looked out at the grey morning. And the grey morning was simply what there was after that. "James and Lily Potter," the note said. "Confirmed dead. Harry Potter, sole survivor." He had known from the moment the owl arrived at 2 in the morning, known with that specific certainty that comes before proof. Knowing in advance turned out not to help. The bright spots in his chest that were the people who had made him a person, who had looked at the werewolf at 11 years old and handed him a name and a place at their table, went out, one after the other like candles in a draught. He put on his coat and went to Godric's Hollow because there was nowhere else to go. The Fidelius charm had collapsed. When the protected party died, the secret died with them, and what was left was an ordinary ruined house on an ordinary lane that anyone could see. Muggles had been gathering since first light, kept back by a policeman with a length of tape. Remus stood at the tape and looked at what remained of the cottage. The collapsed upper story, the blackened stone, the gap where the front wall of the sitting room had been. He had been in that room 3 weeks ago. James had made tea, and Lily had looked up from something she was reading and said something dry and funny that made all 3 of them laugh. He couldn't remember exactly what it was. Standing in the drizzle, he thought he was probably never going to stop trying. He stood there until the crowd dispersed. Sirius had almost certainly already been arrested. Sirius always moved, always acted, always went toward the thing. And whatever had happened on that street with Peter, they would have got Sirius for it. The marauders were one dead, one faking death so brilliantly that Remus himself had believed it, and one standing here in the drizzle with nothing left to hold. He was 21 years old. The second owl arrived at 9:30. Harry Potter had not arrived at Privet Drive. His location was unknown. The Ministry was attempting to trace him. Remus read it twice. Something shifted in him. Not past grief, not instead of it, but alongside it, a colder and more functional thing. He folded the message into his pocket and started moving. Harry was somewhere. Harry was alive. That was enough to begin with. Sirius had known it wouldn't work before he'd walked 100 yards. Known it in the gut-sick way that bypasses argument, that specific certainty of a man walking toward something with no good exit. He'd walked anyway. Peter was standing in the street in the thin November morning, wearing the expression that Sirius had. He now understood, seen before without reading correctly. That cornered quality, that shallow breath, the shallow breath. 12 muggles on the pavement around them, a greengrocer opening his shutters, a woman with a pram. Sirius, Peter said, and his voice cracked on it, and he was already reaching for his wand. He understood in that half-second precisely what Peter was about to do. He understood it completely and was still standing in the street when the explosion happened. The sound hit him in the sternum, the back teeth, the base of his skull, and then there was rubble and smoke and screaming, and 12 people who had been on the pavement were not standing anymore. And Peter was gone. One finger on the cobblestones. Sirius stared at it. He understood, with the terrible gift of clarity that devastation gives, that Peter was alive, underground somewhere, running on 4 small feet. He understood this completely and could not act on it, because the auras had him face down on the smoking street, both wrists pinned, and he was laughing. He was laughing. He couldn't stop. Not because it was funny, because the alternative occupied the same set of muscles, and he couldn't tell any more which he was doing, and apparently neither could the aurors. "Harry," he said, when they hauled him up. His voice sounded wrong. "Harry, someone has him. He's not at Privet Drive. You need to find him." They were reciting the arrest formulation. He told them Harry was alive and missing, and no one was looking. And they recited the formulation, and one of them mentioned 12 muggles, and Sirius said, "Please," and then said it again, and it made no difference at all. By nightfall he was in Azkaban, and Harry was still missing, and no one was listening to that either. A senior goblin at Gringotts spent 45 minutes that afternoon with the delivery log. The courier had followed procedure, consulted the address ledger, delivered to the registered address for Sirius Orion Black, 12 Grimmauld Place, London. The distinction between a registered family seat and a current residential address was not one the ledger captured. The clause had fired on delivery. It had been a one-time instrument. There was no mechanism for reversal. The goblin made a notation in the margin, filed it. Moved on. By the afternoon of the 2nd of November, Remus had a name. It had taken letters to the Gringotts Legal Division, an argument with a ministry clerk who was comprehensively uninterested in speaking to a werewolf about guardianship law, and an invocation of his status as named secondary guardian under the terms of Lily's will. A goblin had confirmed in the flat tone of inconvenient facts that the will had been delivered to 12 Grimmauld Place and the guardian binding clause had fired at that address. The secondary guardian was being formally notified because the primary was unavailable to serve. He stood on the pavement outside 12 Grimmauld Place at 11:30 that night. The house pressed against you sideways, dark and narrow and tall, wedged between two neighbors who never seemed to quite register it. The windows were dark, except for one on the first floor, behind heavy curtains where a dim light moved. Creature with a lantern. Moving with something that was the right size. Remus did not move toward the door. He had no legal standing, only a secondary designation in a will, whose primary beneficiary was somewhere on the North Sea. He could not demand entry from Walburga Black. He had no writ, no authority, nothing this house would recognize. He was 21 years old and a werewolf, and there was nothing to do tonight but stand in the cold and know. Harry was in that house. Harry was alive. He didn't pound on the door. He stood until he was certain, past certain, into the territory of having decided, and then took a scrap of parchment from his coat pocket, wrote 2 words, and tied it to the leg of the small owl that had been trailing him hopefully all day. He watched it disappear into the dark above the rooftops. Dumbledore would have the message before midnight. 2 words, small and precisely insufficient for everything they meant. Found him. January had teeth. The cold that came off the pavement outside number 12 was the patient kind, not November's sharp bite, but something that had been accumulating all December and had no interest in leaving. Remus stood at the corner in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the house. He had been doing this for 3 months. Not all day, not every hour. He had a job of sorts covering a chemist's shop in Islington 4 mornings a week. But on most days since the 2nd of November, he had come to this street and stood and looked at the first-floor window where he had seen Creature's lantern. Once, in December, he had seen a small, pale hand flat against the glass from the inside, there and gone too quickly to be certain of. He had written to Dumbledore. He had received letters back. "I am working on it. Come January." The letter that morning had said, "I will be there at 9. Come with me." He heard footsteps behind him, deliberate, unhurried, the step of a man who had walked toward difficult things enough times that the walking no longer changed the pace. Dumbledore was in his traveling cloak, half-moon spectacles catching the lamplight, silver hair tucked under a hat that made him look slightly less singular than usual. He looked at the house and then at Remus, and there was something in his face that Remus would spend years learning to read. The expression of a man computing the cost of things he should have prevented. "Good morning, Remus, Professor." Dumbledore looked at the house. "Shall we?" The door opened before he had finished knocking. Walburga Black stood in the frame in her customary mourning, black dark fabric, severe cut, and looked at Albus Dumbledore with the expression of a woman who had decided in advance to be formidable and was ready to begin. "Professor Dumbledore." Not a greeting, an announcement. "Mrs. Black," he inclined his head. "I believe we have matters to discuss." A pause, exactly as long as needed to establish that she was admitting him on her terms. Then she stepped back. "Come in." She did not look at Remus. He remained on the step. The invitation had not been extended to him, and he understood this and did not move. The hallway of number 12 was dark, in the way that very old houses are dark. A darkness settled into the corners, with the certainty of something that belonged there. The walls held portraits. Creature was not visible, but the sensation of something just outside his sight line was persistent. The drawing-room door closed. Remus stood on the step in the January cold and waited. She sat in the high-backed chair near the fire, the chair of the room's owner, and laid a folder of documents on the side table with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was confident in the outcome. Dumbledore accepted the folder and opened it. "Gringotts holds the original," she said. "That is a certified copy. I had it produced in October. Lily Potter's will, certified by Gringotts Wizarding Bank, dated the 14th of September 1981. She had been 21. My son, Sirius Walburga said, and the two words together were a complex instrument, compressing more than she would have named, is the named primary guardian of the Potter child. He is not currently able to serve. In his absence, the will designates the Black family seat as secondary residence. The child arrived here by operation of the will's own clause. I am within my legal rights. I have confirmed this with the Gringotts legal office. She had done the work. Dumbledore had not expected the documents. He was not often surprised in negotiations. I do not dispute any of this, he said. Good. She folded her hands. Then we understand each other. Almost, Dumbledore said pleasantly. There is the matter of the secondary guardian, as named in the same document. The pause was longer this time. The werewolf, Remus Lupin, Dumbledore said, named secondary guardian in the same will that names your son, to serve in all capacities in the event the primary guardian cannot. I would like to invite him in. Walburga looked at the fire. Then, for the purposes of the negotiation, only in this room. Creature opened the door with the expression of someone following extremely specific instructions about exactly how reluctant to appear, and Remus stepped across the threshold. The house took him in with the indifference of a building that had seen worse. He followed Creature down the hall, mounted heads on the wall, gaslight in its sconces, the chill of a house where warmth had never been the purpose, into the drawing room where Walburga was in her chair and Dumbledore was standing near the window. Remus sat. He picked up the document, 4 pages, Lily's handwriting. He had known that handwriting since he was 11, on notes passed in the library, on a birthday card in March, on the inside cover of a potions text she'd lent him in 6th year, that he'd returned 2 weeks before the Fidelius, the last time he'd handed her a book. Neither of them had said it might be the last time they saw each other, because saying it seemed like giving up, the second page named him, Remus John Lupin, in full, in the formal spacing of legal language, secondary guardian, to serve in all capacities in the event that the primary guardian is unable to fulfill the role. He read it once, he read it again. Then he set the document on the table and looked at the fire and did not speak. Walburga watched him from her chair. He did not give her anything. Dumbledore said, Creature. Creature appeared in the doorway, carrying Harry, the way he carried everything, with the manner of someone who had assessed the load and found it within parameters. No ceremony, no unnecessary tenderness, and no roughness either. Harry was 17 months old, wrapped against the cold. In dark fabric, he had dark hair that grew in every direction at once. He was looking at the room with the assessing quiet of a child who had learned that new situations were worth examining before reacting to them. Then he looked at Remus. He had Lily's eyes. Remus had known this as a fact. It was repeated everywhere, part of the legend already forming around the boy. Knowing it and encountering it across a drawing room were different propositions. The same quality of attention that said this person was taking you seriously. He had seen those eyes across library tables for 7 years. Remus stood. He crossed the room and held out his arms. Hattus. Harry examined him for a moment with complete seriousness, and then allowed himself to be picked up. He weighed almost nothing, and was also somehow the heaviest thing Remus had held in his 21 years, James and Lily, and 3 months of watching a window, and all of it compressed into this small living fact of a child who was looking at the ceiling with mild interest, entirely unaware of the significance of the moment. Remus held him, and Harry reached up and grabbed a handful of his coat, and Remus did not cry. He was very deliberate about this. Walburga Black was 3 feet away, and he was not going to give her anything. It took. Walburga accepted the terms because they solved her problem. The child generating this inconvenience could now be managed through a legitimate mechanism by someone with legal designation, without the scrutiny of being seen to dispose of the boy who lived. Remus was formally acknowledged as secondary guardian per the written will. Ministry-registered visiting rights twice per week. Effective. A lycanthropy advisory had been attached, a paragraph of conditions, a precautionary clause, which Remus read and folded and put in his coat pocket without expression. Dumbledore signed the confirmatory documentation. The ministry seal went on last. Harry would remain at Grimmauld Place while Remus arranged housing adequate for a small child. This was a first step. Both of them understood, without naming it, that the extraction would take time. On the pavement afterward, Dumbledore said quietly, "You did well." Remus buttoned his coat. He was thinking about 4 pages in Lily's handwriting and the weight of a child who had looked at him with her eyes. "I'll come back Wednesday," he said. He walked home through the January dark, the city going on around him the way cities do, indifferent and continuous, the cold patient and entirely uninterested in everything that had just changed. The kitchen of the house in the village was small enough that Remus could touch opposite walls without quite stretching. This was either a flaw or a feature, depending on the morning. On mornings like this one, September light coming flat and golden through the window, Harry making his determined circuit between the table leg and the radiator, it was a feature. Everything was close. Everything was findable. "Moony," Harry said. "Moony, look." He held up a wooden spoon he had acquired from somewhere. Remus had been facing the stove. "That's a spoon," Remus said. "I know," Harry said, with the gravity of someone explaining something obvious to someone slower than himself. He was 4 years old and had opinions about most things, and strong opinions about breakfast, which needed to be eggs, scrambled, not runny. He had dark hair that went in every direction and green eyes that looked at you the way Lily's had, completely, a bit unsettling, as though he were quietly taking notes. He had been saying Moony since he heard Dumbledore use the name once the previous winter, and had applied it immediately and thoroughly without any interest in correction. Remus had not corrected him. Moony was the last marauder name still in circulation, and it seemed important that someone was still using it. He served the eggs. Harry arranged himself at the table with the spoon in one hand and his fork in the other, prepared for any contingency. "Biscuit after," Harry said between bites. After Harry accepted this and applied himself to breakfast. Through the window, the September garden was still more green than gold. The apple tree at the fence doing what it did each year without anyone asking it to. They had been in this house for almost a year. Walburga had consented to the transfer reluctantly and at length, but she had consented, and Remus had carried Harry out of Grimmauld Place on a cold day in October 1983, and brought him here to a village with a garden and a neighbor called Mrs. Tanaka, who had brought them a casserole the first week, and whom Harry referred to exclusively as the casserole lady. Harry didn't know her name yet. He was 4. He could be forgiven. The biscuits were on the counter in a tin. Remus was washing up, his back to the room, when he heard the small sound, not a clatter, not anything so definite, a kind of arrival. He turned. The biscuit tin was open. One biscuit was sitting in Harry's hand, which had not been near the counter. Harry was looking at the biscuit with an expression of mild scientific interest, as though he were not entirely certain how it had got there, but was prepared to accept the development. "Harry," Remus said. "It came," Harry said. "I see that." Remus dried his hands on the dish towel. He was aware, underneath the ordinary surface of this moment, of a small and careful feeling, the delight of watching it happen, the confirmation of something that had been present, but unproven. And underneath that, quieter, the awareness of what came next. He crossed to the table and crouched to Harry's height. "Do you know what happened just then?" Harry considered. "Magic." "That's right." He kept his voice easy. "That was accidental magic. It happens when you want something very much, and the wanting comes out. It's completely normal." Harry bit the biscuit. He seemed satisfied. Remus went to the sideboard and took out the small journal he kept for these. He recorded them methodically, the date, the object, the apparent trigger. This was the third time this month. He wrote it down with his usual care, and then he closed the journal. And then he sat for a moment with the weight of knowing that somewhere in a ministry building in London, the improper use of magic office had probably logged it already, and someone with a clipboard had made a note, and the note was in a file, and the file had his name on it. He put the journal away. Harry was eating his biscuit. The morning was still golden and ordinary. "Full moon's Friday," Remus said. "You'll go to the Privets Thursday after supper." Harry did not look up from the biscuit. "I know. You can bring the book you're reading. I know, Moony." He said it the way 4-year-olds say. "I know when they mean I have always known this, and also please stop telling me things I already know." It was the tone Harry had perfected for any information he considered already processed. He had been visiting the Privets on full moon nights since he was 2. He knew the routine, the spare bedroom with the quilt that had dogs on it, Mrs. Bland. Privet's cooking, which was very good, Mr. Privet, who let him help water the plants. He knew Moony got sick on those nights, specifically on the nights when the moon was full. Specifically not on any other nights. He had never asked more than that. He seemed in the way of small children who are watching something they don't have words for yet, to have filed the information away for a later date. Remus watched him finish the biscuit and was grateful. Not for the first time for the particular mercy of a 4-year-old who accepted the world as it was presented to him. At Hogwarts, in his office on the lower ground floor, Severus Snape read Dumbledore's letter twice and then set it on the desk. It was a brief communication. A few paragraphs, the headmaster's hand, the usual economy, a routine update on the legal status of Harry Potter. The boy was, well, the guardianship arrangement remained in place. Remus Lupin was the named guardian of record. The child was living in a village in the north. Snape looked out the narrow window at the level of the grass outside. He had expected, he had constructed, in the months after that October, a version of events that he had allowed himself to believe that the boy would be invisible. Growing up in the Muggle world, in ignorance, not knowing his name or what it meant, unknowing and unreachable and irrelevant to Snape's particular calculus of guilt and grief. This had been a clean version. Remus Lupin, the werewolf, had been the one Snape resented least directly, which meant he had resented him most consistently. And at the longest range, Black and Potter had been spectacular enemies, memorable, almost worth hating cleanly. Lupin had stood to the side, had watched, had known what they were doing and had done nothing about it, and had then gone on being perfectly pleasant in the corridors the next morning. And this particular quality, the witness who does not intervene, who preserves his own comfort at the cost of another person's, was the kind of thing that Snape did not forgive and did not forget, and had not, in 13 years, found a satisfactory framework for dismissing. Lily's boy, living in a village somewhere, growing up with a werewolf for a father figure, learning that werewolves were gentle, that the marauders were good men, that his father had been the best friend Lupin ever had, which was undoubtedly true and meant absolutely nothing about what kind of man James Potter had been, or what he had done. Snape folded the letter. He put it in the left-hand drawer and closed the drawer. He did not write back. He was not sure what he would have written. "Tell me about my mum." Harry said that night. It was not a question, it was the tone he had for things he intended to have. Remus closed the storybook, which had been about a dragon who lived under a mountain and had not been listening. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Your mother had dark red hair," he said, "and a laugh that could fill any room she was in. She was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, the best at charms in our year, and very good at potions as well, which is not the same skill at all, and she had both. She noticed things about people. She could tell when someone was putting a good face on something, and she would find a quiet moment and make sure they knew she'd noticed." He paused. "She was funny. She was kind. She was not someone to cross if she thought you were being unfair." Harry had his head on the pillow. His eyes were almost closed. "And my dad. Messy dark hair, hazel eyes, behind glasses, the kind that always needed adjusting. He was always in motion. He couldn't stand still, couldn't sit still, was always looking for the next thing, and usually found it before anyone else did. He was the best friend I ever had, and he knew it, and he was absolutely insufferable about it." "Insufferable," Harry repeated, trying the word, "means he was aware of his own good qualities." Harry appeared to consider this. His breathing was slowing. Remus waited. "They sound nice," Harry said, from some distance that was approaching sleep. "They were," Remus said. "They were very much." He waited until Harry was under entirely, and then he went to the kitchen. He didn't read. He sat at the small table in the dark with his hands around a cup of tea he'd forgotten to drink, and the September night outside was quiet. And he sat there for a while with all of it, the way you sit with things that have nowhere else to go. The door was unlocked when Harry tried it. Unlocked and unstuck in the way that meant Remus had been very tired when he came home. The mornings after were always like this. Harry had been coming back to unlocked doors since he was small enough to barely reach the handle. He came in quietly. He had learned how. Remus was on the sitting room floor, between the sofa and the coffee table, one arm tucked under his head, still in yesterday's clothes, breathing slowly and deeply, which was the sign Harry had learned meant the worst was over. His face had new marks, a scratch along one cheekbone that hadn't been there 2 days ago, and his hands, lying open on the floor, had the same. Harry crouched beside him and looked at the scratches and then at the particular quality of his sleep, the way he lay with everything released at once, like something that had spent the night fighting and was now simply finished. Harry went to the kitchen to make tea. The tea was not good. He knew how to boil the kettle and where the bags were and how much milk, but the water was never quite hot enough by the time it reached the mug. He brought it back anyway and sat on the floor beside Remus and waited. He had been doing this, the coming home, the tea, the sitting, since he was 4. It happened 7 or 8 times a year. He knew the routine, the way he knew the color of the front door. A fact of the house, not something that required explanation. Mooney got sick on specific nights. Harry went to stay with people and came back to unlocked doors and brought lukewarm tea, and then Remus woke up and they had another day. He was 6 years old, and he was not afraid of this. He was not sure why he would be. Remus's eyes opened. He came back to awareness the way he always did after a transformation, not with a start, not like waking from a dream, but piece by piece, the way things reassemble themselves when they have been unmade. He became aware of the ceiling, then the floor beneath him, then the smell of tea, then Harry, cross-legged on the floor beside him, holding a mug with both hands. "Morning," Harry said. Remus looked at him for a moment, very still. "How long have you been there?" "A bit. I made tea. It's a bit cold. Sorry." Remus pushed himself to sitting slowly. He took the mug. He drank the cold tea, without comment. Harry waited. "Harry," Remus said, "I know you're going to tell me something." "I am. Is it a big thing or a medium thing?" Remus considered this with the seriousness it deserved. A big thing, but with a medium amount of danger and a large amount of things being all right at the end. Harry absorbed this. "Okay," so Remus told him. He sat on the sitting room floor with his back against the sofa and his cold tea in his hands, and explained, plainly and without softening it past what a 6-year-old could hold, that he was a werewolf. That this was why Harry went to the Privets on certain nights, the full moon nights, because on those nights Remus changed. It was not something he had chosen. When Remus was a child younger than Harry was now, a man named Fenrir Greyback had bitten him, and the bite had passed the condition to him, and there was no cure. The transformation happened every month and could not be prevented. It was painful, and afterward he needed rest, and the scratches on his face and hands were from the transformation itself. Harry listened without speaking. When Remus stopped, he was quiet. "But you're you," he said. "You're Mooney." Remus looked at him. "I know about werewolves," Harry said. "He read everything in books. They're very scary. But you're the same person after. You're always the same person after." Remus set down the mug. He looked at Harry for a long moment, and his expression held something Harry couldn't name, but would recognize years later as the look of someone who has been afraid of a particular sentence for a long time and has just heard it said plainly and without fear. "Yes," Remus said, "I'm always the same person after." The letter arrived that afternoon while Harry was in the garden. Remus read it at the kitchen table. Ministry of Magic Stationery, the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, Werewolf Registry, and Capture Unit. A formal inquiry had been opened regarding the fitness of Remus John Lupin, registered werewolf, to serve as guardian of an underage wizard. The inquiry cited his condition, his documented employment history, his status under the Classification of Dangerous Beings ordinances. If satisfactory evidence was not received within 30 days, a hearing would be scheduled before the appropriate committee. He read it twice. Then he looked out the window at Harry, who was in the middle of the garden throwing a stick, for reasons that weren't clear since there was no dog. They had been waiting for this. The ministry had the trace records, the accidental magic logs, the documentation of every owl and every ministry registration that had Harry's address and his guardian's name on it. It had taken them 5 years to formalize their discomfort into a letter which suggested that someone had been holding it off, Dumbledore's name acting as a weight on the other side of the scale. But the scale had tipped now. Or someone had decided to test it. He sent a message to Dumbledore through the fireplace, and went outside to watch Harry throw the stick. Dumbledore arrived the following afternoon, stepping from the sitting-room fireplace with the unhurried quality of someone who had reorganized his schedule without mentioning it. He sat in the chair by the window and listened, and then he held out his hand and read the letter himself, with the expression of a man for whom this particular genre of ministry correspondence was entirely familiar. "I will handle it," he said, the tone of something already decided. "The inquiry will be suspended. You have my word. On what grounds?" "As Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, I have the standing to file a review of any departmental determination affecting a child under the court's protection. The committee will find the inquiry procedurally premature. It will be suspended." He returned the letter. "What matters is that it will not reach a hearing." Remus took the letter. He had been watching Dumbledore for 5 years in the particular way of someone trying to read a document he was only being shown 1 page of at a time. The intervention was genuine, the protection was genuine. Dumbledore was, in his way, fond of Remus, and the care for Harry was real. But Dumbledore had an interest in Harry Potter that had nothing to do with Harry being a specific child who deserved a stable home, and Remus had always known this and could not let himself resent it too much, because the alternative was the ministry letter on the table. "Thank you," Remus said. Dumbledore inclined his head. He stayed for tea. He asked about Harry's progress, his temperament, his response to accidental magic. He asked with the attentiveness of someone collecting information, and Remus gave it because it was true that Harry was well, and because some things were not worth fighting about. When Dumbledore left, the room felt exactly as it had before he arrived, which Remus had come to understand was itself a kind of power. That evening he brought 2 chairs to the garden, and Harry dragged a blanket outside, and they sat together looking at the October sky, which had gone very clear and cold and depthless in the way autumn skies sometimes did. "That one," Remus said, pointing, "is Bellatrix." Harry squinted at the spot. "Like a person's name. It is a person's name, several people's. The Black family. Your godfather's family named their children after stars. There's Bellatrix. There's Regulus." He moved his hand. "Andromeda! Further west." "You can't see it well tonight." Harry was quiet, tracking the points of light with the focused attention he applied to most things. "Then is there one called Sirius?" Remus was still for a moment. "Yes. The brightest star in the night sky. It's a summer star, won't be visible now, but it's there." Harry turned to look at him. "That's my godfather's name." "Yes. Where is he?" He didn't answer immediately, and Harry, who was 6 years old and had spent 6 years learning to read the particular lengths of Remus's silences, already knew the shape of the answer before any word arrived. The garden behind the Weasley house was full of people Harry didn't know, which was unusual enough that he stayed close to Remus for the first 10 minutes, which he would not have admitted to anyone. It was August and warm, and the garden had the cheerfully unkempt quality of a place where things grew because they wanted to. Gnomes lurked at the borders. There were tables with food, children running, the sound of adult conversation and laughter mixed in the way of people who had known each other a long time and had the ease to prove it. The loose network of people who had been on the same side of a war and survived it, checking in the way people do when the alternative is pretending it didn't happen. A woman with red hair and a broad, comfortable presence swept toward them, and shook Remus's hand and looked at Harry with eyes that were bright and direct. "And this is Harry," she said. Not a question. Molly Weasley smiled at him with the warmth of someone who had 7 children and plenty of warmth left over, and then she pressed him toward the food table in the manner of someone who believed in feeding people first and acquainting them second. The garden sorted itself into adults near the house and children in the far field, which Harry supposed was the natural order of things. He drifted toward the field, because the alternative was standing next to the adults, listening to them talk about the post-war ministry restructuring, which he had heard about at length and did not find more interesting than the alternative. There were 4 Weasley children visible. 2 of them were identical, red-haired, age somewhere around 10, with the quality of people already planning something, and one taller one with glasses and an expression of careful responsibility, and one smaller one. The smaller one was staring at Harry. Harry looked back. The smaller one had red hair like all of them, and freckles, and was clearly about his own age. He kept staring with an expression that was not quite rude, but was definitely something like he was trying to reconcile 2 different versions of the same thing. "You're Harry Potter," the smaller one said. "Yes," Harry said. The staring continued. Harry had encountered this before from adults, usually, who did the thing where they looked at him, and their faces did something complicated and unasked for. He knew what they were looking for, the scar mostly, which was visible under his fringe. He put his fringe down over it as a reflex, and the smaller Weasley blinked. "I'm Ron," he said. "Ron Weasley. Hello. I've known about you since before I can remember. We all have. My mum has a picture." "Ron," said one of the identical older ones, appearing from nowhere. "Don't be weird about it." Ron went slightly pink. "I wasn't being weird. You were doing the stare." The identical one, Harry hadn't worked out which was which, looked at Harry with the lack of ceremony of someone who had decided the famous person thing wasn't worth lingering on. "I'm Fred, or George, depending on what Ron told you." "He didn't tell me anything yet." "Good start." Fred or George disappeared again, leaving Ron slightly pink and looking at his shoes. There was a moment. "Can you do magic yet?" Ron said. Not staring this time, genuinely curious, the strangeness settling into something more manageable. A bit accidental mostly, Harry considered. Things moving when I want them to. "Last month, I turned the kitchen radio on without touching it." Ron's face changed entirely. "I set the garden on fire," he said. "Not all of it. Just a patch." Mum was not pleased. He paused. "I'm getting better at not doing it by accident." "Same," Harry said. Something dissolved between them, quietly and without ceremony. The way things do when you find a counterpart for an experience you thought was only yours. They drifted toward the far end of the field, where neither of them had to be anyone in particular. Fred and George appeared again, approximately 15 minutes later, with matching expressions that Harry, in his experience with Remus's slightly different but recognizable version of this face, identified as meaning that something was about to happen. "Right," said one of them. "We have a question, a sporting question," the other agreed. They produced from somewhere a small, flat disc, which one of them rolled toward Harry's feet. It skittered along the grass and at a point about a foot from Harry's shoes, made a sharp noise and emitted a burst of purple smoke that smelled strongly of bad cheese. Both twins watched Harry with the attentive interest of researchers awaiting a result. Harry looked down at the disc. He looked at the purple smoke. He considered the smell, which was genuinely quite bad. Then he looked at the twins. "Does it do anything else?" he said. The twins exchanged a glance. "He didn't jump," said one of them. "He absolutely didn't jump," the other confirmed. "He's not supposed to jump," said Ron from behind Harry. "Obviously." "Everyone jumps," Fred said. "That's the entire point of it." "Interesting," said the other one, looking at Harry with an expression that had moved from expectation to something more like genuine assessment. "What did you think of the smell?" "Very bad," Harry said. "Thank you. That's actually useful feedback." They pocketed the disc and drifted back toward their own devices, apparently satisfied with the data. Ron watched them go. "They've been developing that for 3 weeks," he said. "It's a good smell," Harry said. "Very bad. I mean, difficult to ignore." Ron grinned, and the grin did something to his face that made him look suddenly much more comfortable, like a version of himself he was more used to being. Across the garden, Remus had been collected by Arthur Weasley with the energy of a man who had found someone interesting to talk to and had no intention of releasing them quickly. They found a quieter corner near the fence, away from the main conversation. "The misuse of Muggle artifacts office," Remus said. "That's new, isn't it?" Arthur's face lit in the way of someone who has found the topic closest to their heart. 2 years now, the number of enchanted objects in Muggle households is genuinely alarming, but also fascinating. Last week we logged a self-stirring cement mixer. They'd tried to return it to the shop, wouldn't stop. Remus found Arthur's specific and wholehearted wonder about Muggle objects oddly easy to be around. It was the kind of obsession that was entirely benign and had survived the war without becoming wary. They didn't talk about the war directly. They were both the kind of men who had come through it without becoming fluent in the register of people who processed it through talk. They talked about Muggle objects, and about Harry, and about where their children might eventually be sorted. And in the gaps, the war was present in the way of things that don't require naming. "He looks well," Arthur said, watching Harry and Ron across the grass. "He is," Remus said. Arthur nodded and didn't push it. Harry and Ron found each other at the table near the end of the afternoon, filling plates with a second round of food with the deliberate efficiency of people who have learned to eat well when it's available. "September 1991, Ron said, with his mouth slightly full. "Hogwarts, September 1991, Harry agreed. "Same year, both of us." Ron seemed to be thinking about this, chewing. "The train leaves from King's Cross. Platform 9 3/4. "I know." "My brother Percy." Ron indicated the tall one with the glasses, who was across the garden having what appeared to be a very earnest conversation with Molly. "Says the sorting hat takes about 30 seconds for most people." "I know that too." Ron looked at him. "You actually do know a lot of this, don't you?" "Remus has been preparing me since I was 7. Ron considered this. Then, "I suppose we'll see each other on the train then." Neither of them made more of it than that. It didn't need to be more. The drive home. Remus had learned to drive with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a man who had found a Muggle skill interesting and had a car that was very old and sometimes made sounds it shouldn't. Took them through late summer lanes with the sun going low. "Were all wizarding families in the order?" Harry asked. He was looking out the window. "No," Remus said. "Were all the ones who weren't? Were they all on the other side?" Remus kept his eyes on the road. Some people stayed out of it, kept their heads down, hoped it would resolve itself without them having to choose. He paused. "And some people chose the other side." "Yes." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Some of them," Remus said. "Some of them aren't, but should be." He changed gear. The engine made it sound, and some of them are in Azkaban and shouldn't be. Harry looked at him, and then looked back out at the lanes, and did not ask which was which. Not yet. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in July, with the punctuality of something that had always known where it was going. A single tawny owl landed on the kitchen windowsill, presented its leg, and waited with the expression of a professional who had better places to be. Harry untied the letter. The owl left without ceremony. He had been expecting it. He had known since he was old enough to understand what Hogwarts was, which was early, because Remus had not believed in preparing people inadequately that the letter would come, and the question had only ever been. He opened the cream envelope at the kitchen table with the particular calm of someone reading a document they have been waiting for. Heavy parchment, green ink, his name and address written out in full, without incident, because his address was known and had always been known. No owl storm, no absurd sequence of escalating deliveries, just the letter. Remus was at the counter making tea and watching Harry read with an expression that was doing something careful and private, the way his expression sometimes did when he was managing more than one thing at once. "September the 1st, Harry said. He set it on the table. "Diagon Alley for supplies." "We can go on your birthday," Remus said, "the 31st. Harry looked at the letter for a moment, then looked up. "You're doing the thing with your face." "What thing?" "The thing where something is more complicated than you're saying." Remus brought 2 cups to the table and sat. "Dumbledore will want to visit," he said. "He always does, Dumbledore arrived 2 days later, stepping through the sitting-room fireplace with the unhurried quality of someone who treated the manner of arrival as a logistical detail. He was, at 110, the oldest person Harry had spent real time with. Silver hair, half-moon spectacles, a very long beard, the expression of someone simultaneously being pleasant and thinking about several other things at considerable depth. He and Remus moved to the sitting room. Harry, who had apparently gone upstairs, was no longer upstairs. He came down very slowly and very quietly, and was standing in the hallway with the door almost but not quite closed, being very still. He had learned to be still from Remus. He had also learned that adults often failed to account for where children were, particularly adults who had a great deal on their minds. Dumbledore's voice was low and deliberate. The blood protection was never activated. We have known this for 10 years. What changes with Hogwarts is that he becomes visible. He will be in the castle among students and staff, and I will be better positioned to account for him in a way that has been considerably more complicated. From a distance, Remus said something. Harry couldn't catch the exact words. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Hogwarts is the most heavily warded structure in Britain. It is safer than anything I could construct for him specifically, and he should be there. He deserves the education, and the castle provides what no other arrangement could. But I am speaking to you now because the situation requires us both to be clear-eyed. His current state is constrained. The wraith form limits him significantly. He cannot act directly. But the prophecy still stands regardless of his limitations. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be required eventually, Remus. When he returns to a body, and I have every reason to believe he will, the prophecy becomes active in full. I am planning for that." Another exchange Harry couldn't quite hear. Then, "No, what Lily created is entirely separate. The protection in his blood is intact and will remain intact regardless of any address or enchantment. What is absent is the extension I designed, the additional layer that would have operated through Petunia's household. What remains is what Lily gave him at the source. That cannot be unmade." Harry was very still. He had heard the word prophecy before, had heard it the way you hear things that are not quite explained, in the silences after certain conversations, in the slight pause before certain answers. He had heard "the one with the power" before, at the edge of something Remus had once said and then turned away from. He had never heard it in Dumbledore's voice. Dumbledore's voice gave things a different kind of solidity. Things said in that voice arrived with the weight of things that had already happened. The door opened. Remus was looking directly at him from across the sitting room, and his expression was not surprised. Dumbledore left shortly after. Harry could not have said exactly what Remus had communicated to him, but Dumbledore had looked between the two of them and inclined his head with the air of someone who understood when a conversation needed to happen without him in it, and the fireplace had made it sound. Remus sat down at the kitchen table. Harry sat across from him. "How much did you hear?" Remus said. "The blood protection, the prophecy." When Voldemort returns, Remus was quiet. He looked at his hands, then at Harry, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a decision he has been carrying for a long time. He told him the full shape of it. Not the version calibrated for a specific age, not the partial truth selected for what was bearable. Harry was 10 years old, with 2 weeks until he was 11, and 2 months until Hogwarts, and what he deserved was the complete information. Before Harry was born, Remus said a prophecy had been spoken. It described a child who would be born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, and who would have the power to vanquish him. Voldemort had heard it and had moved to destroy the child it described. He had come for Harry on the night of the 31st of October, 1981, because Harry fit the description, born as the 7th month ended, to James and Lily, who had defied him, and defied him. When Voldemort had tried to kill Harry, he had marked him. The prophecy said that either must die at the hand of the other, that neither could live while the other survived. This had been true since before Harry could speak. He told him about Lily. Her death had created a protection, a very old magic, tied to the act of choosing to die for someone else. It lived in Harry's blood. It was the reason Voldemort's killing curse had rebounded. It was not tied to any address, and could not be undone by any error. He told him about the enchantment Dumbledore had designed. The additional layer, the extension through Petunia Dursley's house that would have held until Harry was grown. He told him about the courier, the wrong address, the claws that had fired at the wrong threshold. He told him that this was the reason Harry was here rather than there, and that here had turned out to be its own kind of protection, imperfect and fought for and real. Harry sat with all of this for a while. "You've told me parts of it," he said. "Yes, not all of it." "No." Remus's voice was steady. "I was waiting for the moment when you needed all of it. When the partial version would do more harm than the complete one." He looked at Harry. "I think this is that moment." Harry was quiet. Outside the window, the garden was doing its ordinary late July things. He thought about the pieces he had already had, the star named Sirius, the complicated silences, the way certain answers had been constructed around the one thing not being said. "Did Sirius know about the prophecy?" he said. "Yes. Is that why he's in Azkaban?" Remus looked at him. The silence that followed had several things in it that Harry was only partially old enough to read: grief and something like guilt, and something more complicated underneath both of them that he didn't have names for yet. It was not a clean silence. It held more than one answer, and none of them were complete. On the 31st of July, Remus baked a cake. It was chocolate, and this time the oven had been running hot, and the result was a cake distinctly darker on top than it should have been, filling the kitchen with the smell of scorched sugar. Remus served it with candles. Harry counted 11 and blew them out in a single breath. "Happy birthday," Remus said. "Thank you," Harry said. He ate a piece. The outside was overdone and the inside fine, and there was icing, which improved most situations. The Hogwarts letter was still on the table beside the cake plate. The kitchen smelled of scorched sugar and candle smoke, and underneath those, the particular ordinary warmth of the house that Harry had lived in for most of what he could remember. They did not talk about prophecies or Voldemort or blood that carried something irreversible in it. They ate burned cake, and Remus made tea, and Harry was 11 years old. "Diagon Alley tomorrow," Harry said. "Diagon Alley tomorrow," Remus agreed. The letter sat on the table. Tomorrow they would go to London, and things would begin. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock, and Harry watched the platform disappear through the window with the feeling of a person stepping through a door they have known was there for years. He had been preparing for this. He knew what Hogwarts was: the castle in Scotland, 7 floors, moving staircases, the lake, the forbidden forest, the 4 houses and their histories, the professors and their subjects, the ghosts. He had Remus's careful preparation behind him, like a foundation, and what he felt now was not bewilderment, but something more specific and less comfortable, the anxiety of someone who would be known before they were met. He had grown up being Harry. The boy who lived was a title that sat on him like clothes, ordered in his size by someone who had never seen him. At Hogwarts, there would be hundreds of people who knew his name before he told them, and none of whom would know him. He had a compartment to himself for perhaps 20 minutes before the door opened, and a round-faced boy looked in, holding a toad, and asked if anyone was sitting here. "No," Harry said. "Come in." The boy sat down across from him. He had the toad in both hands, with the concentrated attention of someone whose toad had recently escaped. He glanced at Harry, and then looked away with the specific shyness of someone who has noticed who they're looking at and is trying not to make it a thing. "I'm Neville," he said. "Neville Longbottom, Harry." Neville nodded, looking at the toad. After a moment he said very carefully, not quite as a question, "I know who you are." "I know," Harry said. "Is that all right?" Neville looked at him, genuinely looked, not the half-glance of someone trying to spot the scar. His eyes were the eyes of someone deciding something. "My parents," he said. "Frank and Alice Longbottom. They were Aurors. They, after the war, Bellatrix Lestrange and others, they." He stopped. He looked at the toad. "They're at St. Mungo's. They have been since November 1981. Harry was quiet for a moment. He knew the name, Bellatrix Lestrange. It was one of the Black family star names Remus had pointed at, except Bellatrix was not a star you pointed at with warmth. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a specific way. Neville looked at him. "It's the same war," he said. "Not an accusation. Just an observation." "Yes," Harry said. They sat with this, the compartment moving through the English countryside, and then the conversation became, gradually, and then with more ease, something else. He was good at herbology, and nervous about most other subjects. He was worried about the moving staircases. Harry told him some things that helped with the staircases, and some things about Hogwarts he hadn't known, and by the time they reached Scotland, something had been established between them, quietly and without ceremony. The door opened again about an hour before arrival. A girl with very bushy brown hair and a stack of books looked in, asked briskly if either of them had seen a toad, and when Neville said that was his toad, and it was right here, she came in anyway, and sat down and introduced herself as Hermione Granger. "I've been reading everything about Hogwarts," she said, with the manner of someone reporting a fact that should surprise no one. "I've memorized the entire book list. Have you read A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration? Because the chapter on the theory of atomic reconfiguration is actually quite—" "Remus walked me through the theoretical basis last year," Harry said. He thought the Gamp's Law section was clearer in the 1978 edition. Hermione stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was partly impressed and partly something else, slight adjustment, as though she were recalibrating for a version of this that had not been in her predictions. "Who is Remus?" she said. "My guardian. He was a professor. He taught me—" "Oh," Hermione said. She considered this. "Which edition did you use for potions?" The minor friction between them was productive. It was the friction of two people who have arrived at the same knowledge by different routes, and are not quite sure yet whose route was better, and who are also, underneath this, genuinely interested in the other person's version. The Great Hall was exactly what Harry had expected, and also somehow more than he had expected. The ceiling was what Remus had described, enchanted to reflect the night sky, which tonight was very dark and clear, the September stars beginning to show. The 4 house tables stretched the length of the hall, and the staff table ran across the raised dais at the front, where the professors sat in their robes. Harry took in the room quickly, a habit learned from a man who had learned it from necessity. The ceiling, the floating candles, the dais, the professors. He found Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, whom Remus had mentioned, gone abroad for a year and come back changed. There was something about looking at the man that felt unpleasant, the way certain frequencies were. He looked away. Professor McGonagall brought in the first years and placed the sorting hat on a stool, The hat sang. Harry listened. He had known there would be a song. He had not known the specific texture of hearing the hat's voice in the hall, which was different from reading about it, in the way most things were different from reading about them. He was near the end of the alphabetical list. He sat with the waiting and watched his classmates be sorted and watched the hall, and tried not to count Potter Harry. The hall went silent. It was a specific quality of silence, not the silence before the name, but the silence after, the silence of 400 people having a reaction at once and choosing not to express it, which was louder than noise. Harry walked to the stool. He did not look at the crowd. He sat, and the sorting hat came down over his eyes, and the hole disappeared. The hat was quiet for a moment. Then it began to move through him. It said in a voice that seemed to come from both inside and outside his skull simultaneously. "This one knows who he is." It was not a statement Harry needed to respond to. The hat was already moving deeper, sorting through what it found with the efficiency of something that had done this for 1,000 years. He felt it in the way you feel, an eye exam, the sense of things being looked through rather than at. "I expected a blank page," the hat said. "Most of them are." "You are not a blank page." Harry waited. "You know your parents, not the legend of them, the people. Hair and laughter and the specific way grief has a shape when it's built around described people rather than abstract ones. That is unusual. Most children who arrive here, as you did, arrive in ignorance. You arrived in it considered knowledge. You were given your grief as a gift." He felt the hat moving through the deeper things, the full moon nights, Remus's careful patience, the will in the drawer, the star named Sirius, the prophecy which Harry had known for 1 year and had been carrying with the particular steadiness of someone who picked it up before it could surprise him. "What I find at the bottom of you," the hat said, "is this: you know what is at stake. You have known since you were 10 years old, and you got up every morning anyway. This is not simple bravery. Simple bravery doesn't know the cost in advance." The hall was silent around them. "Gryffindor," the hat said. The red and gold table erupted. Harry lifted the hat off, set it on the stool, and walked to the Gryffindor table in the particular quiet at the center of himself that he had learned from 10 years of being Harry and knowing it. At the staff table, Severus Snape watched. He had imagined this moment in various forms. James Potter's son arriving with James Potter's face and walk and arrogance. He had prepared, in the way he prepared for most things, by constructing in advance the version of himself that would manage it without visible cost. He had not prepared for this. The boy who walked to the Gryffindor table did not walk like James Potter. He walked with the deliberate, measured care of someone who had learned from a man who moved through the world carefully. Lupin's patience, his economy of motion, was in that walk entire, and then the boy sat down and looked up for a moment at the hall, and Snape saw the eyes green. Lily's green, not approximately, not as remembered. Steady, direct, already taking in the room, with a particular quality of attention that was entirely hers and had been hers alone in his experience. The same quality he had seen across desks and library tables and a potions bench for 7 years, and had not seen since 1981, and here it was across a great hall, in this face. Snape looked away. He did this of his own volition before anyone could observe him doing otherwise. It was the only thing in the whole sequence of seconds that he did not choose. Snape opened his first potions class with the questions. Harry had been told about this, had been told specifically to expect it, because Remus had smiled in a way that was doing more than one thing at once and said that Snape's first class for first years had not changed in 11 years. So when the dungeon classroom went quiet after the register and Snape fixed the room with a look that communicated several things at once, Harry was already paying a particular kind of attention. "Mr. Potter," the voice was even and carried. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The room had that specific held breath quality. Harry had the impression that some of the Gryffindors around him expected him to be stuck for an answer. "He wasn't. Draught of living death," he said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The asphodel is a type of lily." He stopped. He had been about to explain the mechanism at length, which was not what had been asked. "Draught of living death," he said again. Snape looked at him. "Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat. It's a stone that neutralizes most poisons. You could swallow a small one if you'd been poisoned, and it would probably save you." "And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" Harry knew this one with the weight of knowledge that has practical context behind it. "There isn't one. They're the same plant, also called aconite. The roots are most toxic. It has a number of uses, including in potions that affect lycanthropes." He kept his voice level. "Purple or blue flowers." Snape said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to the board and began the lesson proper, and for the remainder of the class he called on Longbottom, on Granger, on 2 Slytherins, and did not call on Harry again. The precision of this was noticeable, the deliberate not calling which was not the same as ignoring and not the same as punishing, and which Harry found more interesting than either would have been. After the class in the corridor outside the dungeons, Snape stood with his back against the stone wall and did not move. He had prepared since the September register. Potter, Harry, felt the way you feel, a reminder you had been successfully avoiding. Sharper for the avoidance, he had assembled the version of himself that would manage this. He had not accounted for competence. He had prepared for James Potter's arrogance or for wizarding ignorance. Not for Lily's eyes, in a face that was otherwise James's, delivering accurate answers in a tone that was neither arrogant nor ignorant, but simply measured, simply informed. He had especially not prepared for the moment Harry said wolfsbane with the weight of someone for whom the word had real context, the child of Remus Lupin. Of course, he put this away. He was experienced at putting things away. He had been doing it for 10 years, and the practice had become reliable most of the time. He walked back to his office. He put it away. Harry had been watching Quirrell since the 3rd week of term. It wasn't the stutter that bothered him. Exactly. Stutters happened. Remus had explained this once. It was the specific quality of the stutter, the way it sometimes disappeared between sentences, the half-second where the voice was entirely steady and then remembered to be otherwise. It was the way Quirrell moved his eyes across any given room, touching each wall, and then the door, and then the ceiling, in the pattern of a man who was checking something, rather than just looking. It was the smell of garlic that hung around him like a decision, and underneath the garlic, Remus had taught him to pay attention to what was underneath things, something that wasn't quite a smell, but registered the same way. Remus had mentioned Quirrell once, in the course of explaining who would be teaching what. He had said, "Gone abroad for a year." And there had been a pause that said more than the sentence. Harry hadn't asked at the time. He filed it now. He mentioned it to Neville one evening, in the common room, quietly, while Hermione was doing something complicated with her defense notes nearby. "The defense professor," Harry said. "Quirrell. Something is off." Neville looked at him. He had learned in 8 weeks of knowing Harry that when Harry said something is off, it was worth listening to. What kind of off? I don't know exactly. The stutter isn't what it seems. And the garlic, Harry considered. The garlic is too deliberate. People don't wear garlic accidentally, in those quantities. Neville was quiet for a moment. He's supposed to be keeping something safe, isn't he? In the school. Everyone knows about the third floor. Everyone knows something is on the third floor, Harry said. They don't know what. They sat with this. Neither of them had a conclusion to add, so they didn't add one. On October the 31st, Harry did not go to the feast. The common room emptied out in groups and pairs. Harry sat by the fire with a book he was not reading. Neville came back from the portrait hole and sat across from him. I told them I'd eaten too much at lunch, Neville said. You didn't have to stay, I know. Neville looked at the fire. Gran takes me to St. Mungo's on the 5th of November. Every year, she says it's important to mark the date, even when they don't know I'm there. He looked at Harry. I think marking dates is important. They sat while the feast went on without them. No agenda, just presence. Two boys who understood that some dates couldn't be eaten through. At 7:15, Quirrell burst into the great hall. Harry and Neville heard it from the common room. Not the words, just the distant commotion that preceded the announcement, the particular quality of sound that meant something had changed. They looked at each other. Meant something had changed. Then the fat lady's portrait opened, and a prefect put her head in and said, "Troll in the dungeon," and there was a pause before she added, "Thought you ought to know." And Harry was already standing. He said, "Hermione." Neville understood immediately. Hermione had not gone to the feast. She had been in the library when they last saw her, working on something for charms, and she had said she'd go to the feast eventually, but her tone had not been convincing, and that was an hour and a half ago. They found her in a corridor near the girls' bathroom on the second floor, which was where the troll was. It was 12 feet tall and grey-skinned, and had the particular quality of presence that very large things in small spaces have, which is that the size ceases to be a number and becomes something you experience in your chest. It was using the club on the walls in a general and exploratory way. The smell was considerable. Hermione had her back against the opposite wall and was looking at the troll with an expression that Harry recognized as a person processing an emergency with everything they had. Not panicked, not screaming, but white-faced and absolutely still and visibly calculating with enormous speed. "Wingardium Leviosa," Harry said, remembering the lecture in charms, because it was the first useful thing in his head. "That's a first-year spell?" Hermione said, in the tight voice of someone who is simultaneously terrified and cannot help pointing out relevant information. "Exactly," Harry said. "You've been practicing it." Then she raised her wand. The club lifted off the troll's wrist. The troll looked up at it. With the uncomplicated confusion of a creature for whom things had never previously levitated. The club rose to approximately the height of the troll's head, and then Hermione lost her grip on the spell, and it fell. Directly onto the troll's head, with a sound that was definitive and conclusive. The troll sat down. In the corridor, afterward, the three of them were quiet for a moment, in the way of people who have just processed a great deal very quickly and are waiting for their various systems to catch up. Hermione was still holding her wand. Harry was leaning against the wall. Neville was sitting on the floor, which seemed to Harry like a reasonable response. "The stutter," Harry said, when he could form a sentence. Quirrell's stutter completely disappeared when he ran into the feast. "I noticed," Neville said from the floor. Hermione looked at both of them. She had the expression of someone recalibrating her model of several things at once. "You two," she said, "have been paying attention to things I haven't been paying attention to." "Yes," Harry said. "Tell me," she said. He did. Most of the castle emptied out on the 23rd of December. Harry stood at a window in the Gryffindor Tower and watched the carriages leave. The stream of students with their trunks and their owls, the platform thinning out below until what remained was snow, and the particular quality of quiet that very large spaces acquire when the people have left them. He had a home to return to. Remus was 45 minutes from King's Cross, and whose December full moon fell on the 22nd, which meant the timing would require arrangement, and Harry had found, without quite deciding to find it, that he didn't want to be arranged around the full moon right now. He wanted Remus to have the days, after a transformation, to simply be, without managing anything else. He wrote a letter saying he'd stay for the holidays and they'd celebrate in January. He did not look too closely at what he was telling himself. His reason was, he slept badly, and on the third night of the holidays he put on his father's invisibility cloak, received as an anonymous Christmas present, Dumbledore's doing clearly, and went walking. The unused classroom was on the 4th floor, behind a door. The corridor seemed designed not to invite you to notice. He tried it because he had nothing to do and nowhere to go. Inside the room was dark, except for the thing at the far end that had its own light. The mirror was large and gilded and ornate, taller than he was. He read the inscription by working at it, reversed, written for reflection. "I show not your face but your heart's desire." He looked into it. Lily was there immediately. Dark red hair and green eyes that were his eyes. He had known this intellectually, but not yet experienced the particular strangeness of looking at yourself in another face. She was laughing at something. 21 when she died, and always 21 in the mirror, and her face was doing exactly what Remus had described. A laugh that could fill any room. James was beside her. Dark, messy hair, Harry's hair, or Harry's hair was his, and hazel eyes behind glasses, and even in the mirror's stillness, the quality Remus had described was present, always in motion, always looking at the next thing. He was looking at Lily with the expression of someone who finds the person they're looking at endlessly interesting, and beside James, Sirius Black. Harry had seen a photograph of Sirius once. Remus kept one in the drawer. He did not usually open. In the photograph, he was young and extremely handsome, laughing at something out of frame. In the mirror, he was the same, at ease, occupying his own face without the hollowness that Azkaban put in people, his hand on James's shoulder. All four of them together, in the specific configuration that had not existed since October 31st, 1981, Harry stood very still. He had love. Remus had made this structurally impossible to doubt. Warmth, attention, the specific regard of a person who had decided to raise him well. It was real, and it was present, and it did not stop him from standing in front of this mirror for a very long time. What he wanted was not abstract. Not a family in the general sense. These people. This laughing, this specific configuration that had existed before he was born, and that he had received only as description. He came back the following night. He knew exactly what kind of thing he was doing. Remus had warned him once about the seductiveness of desires you can't act on. He came back anyway, 3 nights. Then a 4th. On the 4th night, he was standing in his usual place, about 6 feet from the mirror, when he heard footsteps in the corridor, and became very still. The door opened. Snape stood in the doorway. He had a lamp, and his expression was the expression of a man who had expected to find nothing and is recalculating. He looked at Harry. He did not look at the mirror. He was quiet for a long moment. Harry did not speak either. The mirror was there between them in the sense of being relevant to whatever was happening, without being directly addressed. Snape was watching Harry's face. Harry understood, after a moment, that Snape was watching Harry's face the way you watch the face of someone who is reading something you can see the reflection of, not the text itself, but the response. He was reading what Harry's expression was doing in front of the mirror, and something in what he found there made Snape go very still. He stood in the doorway for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been longer. Then he turned and left without speaking, and his footsteps retreated down the corridor and were gone. Harry stood alone with the mirror for a few more minutes. Then he went back to bed. Snape walked back to his office and sat in the dark without lighting the lamp. What he had seen on Harry's face, the grief, the specific quality of wanting something that cannot be given back, he recognized with a precision that was not comfortable. He had been carrying that same thing since 1981. He sat for a long time and did not name what he had just seen, because naming it would mean acknowledging the recognition, and the recognition was not something he had agreed to carry. On the 5th night, Dumbledore was already in the room. He was sitting on a chair. He had apparently conjured several feet to the side of the mirror, with the posture of someone who has been waiting without impatience for a while. He looked at Harry with his usual expression, which was warm, and also thinking about several other things simultaneously, and he said, "You've been coming here rather a lot, I think," Harry said. "I know what it does. I expect you do." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you see?" Harry looked at the mirror. "My parents. And Sirius." He paused. "The whole of it. What should be. The mirror shows the deepest desire of the heart," he said. "Men have wasted away before it, not knowing whether what they saw was real or possible. It does not discriminate between the achievable and the lost." "I know," Harry said. "Remus told me about desire traps. Things that show you what you want in a form that looks like it could be reached. This is that," Dumbledore said. "Yes?" They were quiet together for a moment. Then Harry said, "Did you know about the will, the routing error? When did you find out the quality of Dumbledore's stillness changed?" "I did not know," he said. "Until the night of November 2nd, 1981, Remus sent me an owl. 2 words." He paused. By that time the Guardian binding clause had already fired. Harry was already at Grimmauld Place. There was nothing to be done about the routing itself. Harry looked at the mirror. "But did you know what my mother had arranged?" "Before, when she was still alive." The silence that followed this was different from the previous silences. It had something in it that was not quite Dumbledore's usual considered pause. "No," Dumbledore said. "I designed the plan for Privet Drive, the blood protection enchantment, the arrangement with Petunia, without knowing that Lily had already made her own provision. I had not asked her. I had considered the will's process more complex, more vulnerable to error than what I designed. I had not," he stopped. "I did not know that she had already acted. I had not thought to ask." Harry looked at him directly. "She made a will in September 1981. She named Sirius. She named Remus. She made provision for what would happen if she died, at 21, with a Fidelius over her house. And you were planning Privet Drive." "Yes," Dumbledore said. Harry turned back to the mirror. He looked at Lily's face for a long time. "I believe you," he said, "that you didn't know." He said it carefully because it was true, and it cost him something. Believing it meant that no one had made a deliberate choice that led here. A Goblin Courier, and a wrong address, and a series of accidents. Which was in some ways worse, and in some ways not. Dumbledore was quiet. "I will have this mirror moved," he said, "to somewhere it cannot be found so easily. I should have done it sooner." Harry nodded. He looked at the mirror one more time. Lily laughing, James in motion, even standing still. Sirius, his hand on James's shoulder, everything about him the before Azkaban version. On the 6th night, he went to the corridor and found an empty room. He stood in the dark for a while. The cold of the castle around him, the stone floor, and the dark, and the particular silence of a place that is missing something it held recently. He stood in the middle of the empty room, and quietly, to no one, he said the names. Lily James, and then Sirius, who was still alive, who was still, technically, his godfather, who had been in Azkaban for 10 years for something Harry had been given to understand. From a silence, from the shape of an unanswered question, was not as simple as it had been presented. He stood there for a while and then went back to bed, and the room stayed empty behind him. They had pieced it together over 3 weeks, Harry and Neville and Hermione, in the evenings after supper, when the common room had thinned out enough that a quiet conversation stayed quiet. Quirrell was the threat. The stone was under the trap-door. If Dumbledore was called away by a false alarm, whoever wanted the stone would move. On the evening of the 24th of May, Hermione came back from the owlery and said, "He's gone. I watched the owl leave, a ministry owl." Harry said, "Then we go now." He did not feel heroic about this. He felt the cold clarity of a decision already made, not courage so much as the removal of the alternative. He thought briefly of Remus arriving on the 1st of June to collect him at term's end, and filed this as a reason rather than a hesitation. The 3rd-floor corridor was empty. The door to Fluffy's room was unlocked, which meant someone had already come through. The 3-headed dog was asleep across the trap-door, and from beneath came the faint sound of harp music running down. The dog was beginning to stir. "Ha! Something," Harry said. "Music keeps it under." Hermione hummed, something from a Muggle radio program, apparently, which was not dignified but was effective. The dog's head swayed and stilled. Harry pulled the trapdoor open and they dropped through. Devil's Snare reached up to meet them. The plant grabbed with the efficiency of something that had been waiting, tendrils curling around limbs with the patient strength of deep roots. Harry knew this one. Herbology, week 3, and went still instead of struggling, which slowed it. Beside him, he could hear Neville going still as well. From his left came the sound of Hermione saying, "Lumos Maxima," with the focused tone of someone who has already identified the relevant countermeasure, and a burst of blinding light made the plant recoil all at once, dropping them onto a stone floor below. The flying keys were above them in a tall, dark chamber, circling in a slow mass, the candlelight catching on their wings. One of the brooms was on the floor. Harry was already picking it up. He had spent 9 months on Gryffindor's Quidditch pitch. He had reflexes for this. He shot upward into the mass of keys and tracked for the largest lock on the door and found the keyhole size with his eye, and then found the matching key by its shape and age, the rust on its wingtips, and snatched it from the air on the 3rd pass and was back on the ground in under 2 minutes. The chess room was enormous and very cold. The pieces lined up across the black and white squares in silence. Neville looked at the board for a long time. He had grown up with a grandmother who did not believe in making things easy, who had taught him that surviving being underestimated meant thinking 3 moves ahead of the person doing the underestimating. He stood at the edge of the board and looked at the arrangement with the expression Harry had learned meant Neville was doing something quietly serious. "You two go there, and there," Neville said. "Don't play any pieces. Don't take any shots. I'll handle the board." Neville, I've been thinking about this since November. He stepped onto a square. A stone knight's horse turned to face him. Trust me. Neville moved pieces with the deliberate calm of someone making expenditures rather than losses, 2 pawns, a bishop, and kept Harry and Hermione unthreatened while the board reorganized around his approach. 12 minutes later, the way through was open. "Checkmate," Neville said. The troll in the next chamber was already down, and had been for some time. They stepped around it without lingering. The smell was significant. The final room was filled with 7 bottles on a table, and a line of fire blocking the door forward, and a line of fire blocking the door behind. Hermione read the logic verse written on the scroll beside them, and stood very still for a moment with her eyes closed, and then opened them and pointed. "That one goes forward. That one goes back. Take one of each." She picked up a bottle. "Logic puzzle, not magic." Quirrell forgot that some people can think. Harry took the forward bottle. The flame went cold at his touch, and he walked through into the dark of the final chamber and let the door close behind him. The room was empty. Except for the mirror, it was exactly as he'd found it in December, which meant it hadn't been here in December and had been moved back. The gilded frame, the inscription reversed along the top, the dark glass that showed him, as it always had, not his face, but his heart's desire. He walked toward it slowly. He understood now what he hadn't understood. Fully in December, the stone would go to whoever wanted to find it but not use it, and the mirror would give it to whoever looked into it and saw themselves possessing it and handing it on. Dumbledore had told him this in the corridor in June, explaining the mechanism after the fact, and Harry had turned this over in his mind for 5 months, and now he stood in front of the mirror and looked. He saw himself in the glass. His reflection reached into its pocket and drew out a small red stone and set it in Dumbledore's open palm. As the reflection opened its hand, Harry felt something cold and small and unexpected press against his own palm from inside his pocket. He closed his fingers around it. The Philosopher's Stone. "Very good," said a voice from the doorway behind him. Quirrell was there. He had walked through the fire without apparent difficulty, which confirmed several things Harry had suspected. The professor was watching him with an expression that was entirely different from the vague, stuttering manner of the classroom. Steady, focused, cold. "Give it to me," Quirrell said. "No," Harry said. "You understand," Quirrell said, still in that steady voice, "that you have no particular protection here. I know about the Privet Drive enchantment. I know it was never activated. The goblin's error was documented. You are not under any specific shield. You are simply a boy." He reached up and began to unwrap the turban. The face on the back of Quirrell's head was something Harry's mind registered in pieces rather than all at once. Chalk white, no nose, red slit eyes. The wrongness of it, acute in the way of things that are almost but not quite a face. The voice that came from it was high and cold, and had the quality of something that had practiced every word for a very long time. "The blood enchantment Dumbledore designed," the voice said, "was never activated. You are aware of this, I think." "So am I. A Goblin Courier, a wrong address, and 10 years of careful planning came to nothing. You have no protection, Harry Potter. I have waited to verify this personally." He thought about Remus, sitting in a kitchen in the dark, about Walburga Black's drawing room, about the weight of a will in Lily's handwriting, about 4 nights in front of a mirror. "You might be right," he said, "about Privet Drive." Quirrell's hands seized his wrist. The burning began immediately, and absolutely, the way a thing begins that has been true for a long time, and is simply now being demonstrated. Quirrell's hand blistered. The sound Quirrell made was not a word, but the sound of a body processing something it could not process, and the grip did not loosen so much as cease to function, and Harry stumbled back and watched what happened to a hand that had made contact with the protection that lived in his blood. Not the Privet drive enchantment, not the extension Dumbledore had designed, the older one. The one that had been in him since Godric's Hollow, since a woman 21 years old had stood between her child and a killing curse and left something irreversible in the blood of the child who survived. Not any address, not any enchantment, just what it meant to be loved that way. Quirrell burned. The wraith tore free with a sound like nothing Harry had a name for, tore upward through the room, shrieking, and was gone, and Quirrell's body crumpled and Harry's knees went next, and the last thing he saw before the floor was the stone still in his hand. Neville and Hermione found him on the other side of the flame wall, which had dropped when the room's purpose was fulfilled. Hermione said his name twice with the controlled panic of someone managing panic very hard. Neville put his hand on Harry's shoulder and said, "Stone!" Harry opened his hand. "Red, whole stone," he said. They got him up. He could stand after a moment, not well, and not without a hand on each arm. And they went back through the logic room and the troll room and the chess room and the keys and the devil's snares, burned remains, and up through the trapdoor. And Fluffy was still sleeping above them, and the third-floor corridor was still empty. And by the time they reached the hospital wing, Harry was upright, mostly under his own power, and the stone was in his pocket, and Neville had not let go of his arm the entire way back. He woke to the smell of antiseptic and summer, which was a specific combination, astringent and warm at once, that told him before he opened his eyes that he was in the hospital wing and that it was June. Through the tall windows the grounds were bright, the lake flat and silver in the morning light, the edge of the forbidden forest dark against the sky. He was alone for a moment. Then he wasn't. Dumbledore was in the chair beside the bed, not having arrived, simply present, as though he had been there already and the room had just decided to include Harry in it. He looked as he always looked, silver-haired, half-moon spectacles, the long beard, the expression of someone simultaneously here and several layers deep in something else. He was watching Harry with the unguarded attention he only gave when he was not managing the impression he made. "The stone," Harry said. "Safe," Dumbledore said. "And you." Harry sat up carefully. He was stiff, and his hands ached, and there was a specific quality of tiredness that came from doing something his body was not designed for yet. But he was whole. He was alive. He looked at his hands, no marks, nothing visible, and then at Dumbledore. "I want to understand the distinction," Harry said, "between what you planned and what actually happened." Dumbledore. Then he said, "All right," so he explained it. What Dumbledore had designed for Privet Drive would have created a specific shield, a safe house, warded against Voldemort himself. Operative, as long as Harry called it home. Built on Lily's sacrifice, Mechanism 1. Dumbledore's work designed to hold for years. Mechanism 2 was older and did not belong to Dumbledore. When Lily had stepped in front of the killing curse, she had activated an ancient magic, the kind that cannot be designed or planned, only given. The choice to die for someone, freely made, left something in the blood of the person you died for. This was what had burned Quirrell. This was what had turned a killing curse in 1981. It had nothing to do with Privet Drive or any enchantment. It required only that Lily had chosen Harry's life over her own. "So what you planned would have been extra," Harry said. "Yes. And it still would have been better if it had worked. Yes, The enchantment I designed would have extended through your childhood, a safe location, specifically shielded from Voldemort. For years you could not protect yourself. A pause. You did not have that. I should have looked before I planned, Dumbledore said. I designed it without knowing what your mother had already arranged. I had not asked her. I should have. It was a long silence. Harry let it be. Is that the first time you've said that? He said finally, out loud to someone it was owed to. Yes. Harry looked at him. There was something in Dumbledore's face that was not quite what he usually showed, less arranged. All right, Harry said. Then, Sirius Black has been in Azkaban since November 1981. He was convicted, but Remus doesn't believe he did it, and you've never contradicted that, have you? Dumbledore was very still. No, he said. I have not. Then why is he still there? The silence that followed was not the silence of someone considering how to say something. It was the silence of someone who does not have a good answer. There was no trial, Dumbledore said. The Ministry processed him as a known Death Eater, the evidence, the testimony, and the weight of the moment. It was November 1981. The war had just ended. The Ministry was not careful. He paused. I did not intervene. I did not challenge the procedure. I did not look as hard as I should have at what had been done with Sirius Black. That is not a good answer, Harry said. No, Dumbledore said. It is not. The silence settled. Not angry, too honest for anger, too tired. Through the window, the summer grounds continued to be bright and ordinary. Remus arrived at midday. Harry was sitting up with a textbook open on his knees when the doors opened. Remus stood in the doorway for a moment, 32 years old, graying early, robes chosen by habit rather than intention, and looked at Harry, who was slightly pale and very much alive. He sat in the chair beside the bed and did not speak immediately. Harry did not require it. You stayed, Remus said. I had to. I know, you also could have told Dumbledore instead of going down yourself. I know. Then, and you're fine. Mostly, my hands ache. Madame Pomfrey says it's residual. Remus was looking at him with the expression he had for things he was processing carefully. What happened? Harry said. Is that Lily's protection worked? Not the Privet drive enchantment. The one in my blood, Dumbledore explained the difference. It burned him. Remus was very still, and then he nodded once, slowly, with the weight of a man absorbing something he had hoped for. 11 years. Without certainty. Remus, Harry said. I think Sirius might be innocent. Remus looked at him. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something you've been carrying alone and have just had named by someone who also sees it. Then, I know 2 words. The weight of 10 years in them. The star named Sirius, the photo in the drawer, the complicated silences. He had always known. He had not been able to act on it. 2 more years, Harry said. The end-of-year feast was already in progress when Harry and Neville and Hermione found their places at the Gryffindor table, and the hall was warm and loud with the sound of a year completing itself. Harry sat between them. Neville on his left, Hermione on his right, the 3 of them in the easy proximity of people who have been in a dungeon together and will not be speaking of it until they've eaten something. They were a strange group, he knew this, and found it accurate rather than troubling. The boy whose parents had been taken by a killing curse, raised by the last of a broken pack of friends, the boy whose parents were alive somewhere in St. Mungo's, present and entirely gone. The girl who had arrived knowing everything and had found things this year that no book had prepared her for. They had survived together, which was not the same as having planned to be together, but was in some ways better. They ate. The food was good. The hall was full. Gryffindor won the House Cup by a margin that had something to do with a late night in May and the specific determination of 3 first years, and the red and gold banners were bright overhead, and Harry ate his dinner and listened to Neville and Hermione arguing about whether the wizard's chess theory Neville had used was conventional or his own invention, which it was, and that was enough. The Hogwarts Express moved south through Britain in the last afternoon of the school year, and Harry had a compartment mostly to himself except for Neville, at the other end, asleep with his mouth slightly open, and Trevor, the toad, on his knee. He looked out the window. England slid past, green and golden in the June light, fields and roads and the small backs of houses, and the occasional glimpse of something industrial. He was going home. Not to Privet Drive, which smelled of the Dursleys and the specific combination of carpet cleaner and resentment and a future that had not happened. Home to the village where the kitchen was small enough to touch both walls and the garden. Had an apple tree, and Remus would have forgotten to turn the oven down in July and burned another cake. He thought about Sirius. The man in the star's name, the pre-Azkaban photograph, the figure who appeared in the mirror at Christmas beside James, and laughing. Still in Azkaban as the train moved south. Still innocent if what they both suspected was true. Still his godfather technically, in every legal and actual sense. 2 more years. He thought about the prophecy, which was unchanged. Voldemort had fled Quirrell's burning body as a wraith, and was somewhere still existing, still the specific dark thing that the prophecy had named. Neither can live while the other survives, unchanged, unresolved, belonging to the future, in the way that certain things belong to the future and cannot be moved out of it. He looked at his hands, which had burned through a man's grip with his mother's choice. He had not been raised in ignorance. He had not been raised in a cupboard, not in a house where he was something to be concealed and diminished. He had been raised with his name and his parents' names and the true story of them, imperfect and partial and human. He had been raised by someone who got up after the full moon and made eggs and did not correct the nickname. He had been raised to know that grief was not a thing to be solved, but a thing to be carried, and that what you carried could also be what held you. He was 11 years old, and he was going home, and he knew who he was. He looked out the window at Britain going